Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's time again for Rising Tide Changemakers, where we share the stories of unique individuals who bring big ideas to life, advance knowledge, build companies, and put meaningful change in motion. With the man who does all that every time he's on the show, our host, Greg Weiss. Hey, Craig.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Welcome, Amy Edinger, my colleague from Cell and Developmental Biology here at UCI. She's the founder of Seige Pharmaceuticals, and I'm really excited to talk to her about this process. So welcome, Amy, and maybe we can get started by just telling us about you.
Okay, thank you, Greg, for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here chatting with you. So I, as you mentioned, am a co-founder of Seige Pharmaceuticals and also a professor at UCI, where I've worked for 16 years. I teach introductory biology to freshmen. I'm the equity advisor working for diversity and inclusion in science, and I also run a lab, and I have 2 teenage girls as well. And I guess one thing I wanted to throw out there is I am an animal lover. We were chatting before the show about this, and that's really what inspired me to go into science when I was a kid. I always wanted to have a pet. And my mom is kind of a very tidy person and did not want a pet in the house. So it wasn't until I decided to go to vet school that I got all the contact with animals that I wanted. And when I was at UC Davis trying to get into vet school, one of the things you had to do was work with a veterinarian for 100 hours. And there were so many pre-vet students at Davis that I had to work in a research lab with a vet. But that ended up being a real bright spot because it convinced me that I wanted to go on and do a PhD and eventually become a scientist.
And so it's this moment at UC Davis that ends up changing your course of your career. Do you think that early experience, though, as an animal lover and thinking about repairing animals, really, does that influence your molecular research today? Because now you're working not at the level of animals, but at the level of cells and molecules.
Yeah, so there's a lot of interest in producing MD PhDs who have the clinical background to understand disease as well as the scientific background to understand the molecules and proteins that cause the disease. But I think veterinary PhDs, veterinary researchers, are kind of an underappreciated resource because, they say that an MD degree is 6 inches wide and a mile deep, whereas a vet degree is a mile wide and 6 inches deep, right? So I know a ton of things about lots of different systems, how different animals differ, and I think that provides a really important perspective that helps to guide my research and to really understand what the important questions are. Not just what can we answer, but really what should we answer.
So it's almost like market research for starting companies and starting new ideas, new research directions.
Yeah.
So your laboratory here at UCI pursues a number of different directions. Can you tell us about your program to starve cells?
Sure. Yeah. So that's where the name Seige pharmaceutical comes from, right? Is
Very
we're trying
cool.
to, attack cancer by starving it to death. And so when I was a postdoc, I found out that there's this yeast molecule. It has a horrible name, phytosphingosine, but it's from this class of molecules called sphingolipids. And they actually cause yeast to stop growing under dangerous conditions. And that's a protective mechanism. It's sort of like how bears hibernate in the winter. So this class of molecules, the sphingolipids, it triggers this hibernation response in normal cells. But in cancer cells, they're trying to grow all the time. They're sort of locked in this on position. And when you try and stop them, they die. So that's kind of where the safety margin or the therapeutic index comes from with our drug is normal cells act like bears and hibernate. Mm-hmm. And I have this picture I love to show of a bear in the winter sitting at a picnic table and there's no food on it, right? So that's the cancer cell, right? They don't know how to hibernate. So when we expose them to our drugs, they die. They don't hibernate. That's the model.
So even though we're humans and we don't hibernate at all, we still have mechanisms in our cells that are kind of deep evolutionary things that haven't been lost yet?
Yes, your cells can hibernate. And that's actually, it's kind of a complication. It's one way that certain cancer cells can escape therapeutic drugs. So we have to keep that in mind as a potential caveat, is some cancer cells can hibernate and they might be able to hide from our drugs. So that's one of the things that's important in drug development for cancer, right, is figuring out which cancer classes are going to be most sensitive. That's this also idea of personalized medicine, right? We figure out exactly what kind of tumor each individual has, what particular mutations they carry, and then we can target them very specifically with a personalized program. So, I think that the concept that we're developing will be broadly effective in lots of people with lots of different kinds of tumors, but there will be some that won't respond. So the more we understand about how the drug works, the better we can predict who the right people are to treat with this compound.
All right, this sounds fascinating. It sounds really important research. But what moment inspired you to start a pharmaceutical company? You're doing this great research, you're publishing great. Why start a company?
It actually wasn't a happy moment. It was kind of a sad moment when I was in my office and I realized that I just couldn't develop these compounds as drugs in the academic framework. It just wasn't going to work. I'm a reviewer for the NIH. They want hypothesis-driven research. And the kind of things you have to do for drug development, they aren't that. It's also extremely expensive. And so the NIH does have some programs for drug development, but there isn't enough capacity for all of the ideas. And I'd applied to one of these NIH programs and our concept wasn't selected. And so at that point I said, okay, I'm just going to have to do this myself. Nobody's going to help me. And that's when the journey began.
Wow. And it's been an exciting journey?
Yeah. It's been exciting, ups and downs, highs and lows. Yeah. Yes.
So now, if your interest then really is it's cells and metabolism and cells taking in nutrients. Mm-hmm. And I know you got into veterinary things because you're interested in animals and especially horses. Mm-hmm. Now, I know anyone who rides horses experiences that metabolism. You feel the heat coming off the horse, mm-hmm. or you're shoveling, tons of the end products or literally tons of hay. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's some deep-seated interest in how animals and cells take in things and eat them and transform them?
Yeah, one thing that I really appreciate about this concept is I like to go and talk to groups of patients or just other mm-hmm. people who are stakeholders. And you can present this idea of starving things to death and causing them to hibernate, and everybody gets it. And one of the best things about it is when I go to these meetings with patients or normal people, they ask really great questions. Sometimes I think that they really see the forest when a lot of times the scientists were focused on the trees. And so
Right.
I have to say, from those conversations with the average people, right, not scientists, no PhDs, I've gotten some really great ideas about questions we really should ask or different avenues we should pursue. So I guess what I'm saying is I think the idea is accessible. It's just kind of basic and people generally get it. So hopefully that means the idea is robust and will actually work.
And then, so you're inspired by these people asking these questions.
Mm-hmm.
Does that in turn drive the questions that you ask in your research? Do you ever come back and say, they asked me this question, I can't answer it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
And so I think that's something I talk about a lot because I train students and postdocs, right? You can always think of a bunch of questions, right? But what's really hard is figuring out which are the right ones to answer. And so in my lab, sometimes what decides whether it's the right one to answer is what's going to happen if you figure it out. What's the impact? How will this affect people and patients and drug therapy? Right? How will this move things forward? So not answering things just because we're curious, but because it will make a difference.
So that's really inspiring in of itself. But what advice can you give other academics who are interested in starting a company?
The first one is be persistent. So I say, Richard Sudek was really helpful just
Mm-hmm.
as kind of a support system.
Director of Beal Applied Innovation.
Yeah. So in one of those tough times, I actually ended up quitting my own company at one point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was really disturbing. I sort of felt like I'd had open heart surgery or something. I sat in my pajamas all day Saturday. And one of the things that I did was watch Richard's video on failure. Right. And so that's one of the things that I have learned from being an entrepreneur is the value of failure. And in academics, we're taught to hide our failures and not admit mistakes. Right. But in the business world, it's like you embrace them and learn from them. Right. You're not trying hard enough if you're not making mistakes, if you're not failing. Right. And so that has been, I think, kind of a gift to me of this whole getting involved in applied innovation and just entrepreneurialism in general is learning that failing isn't something you should be ashamed of. So that's the message I try and communicate to academics. That's message one. Message two is success depends on networks, right? So you never know who's going to help you out. So
That's
being
true.
kind and talking to everybody and showing respect towards everybody and their opinions is super important. Like what I
Yes.
said, talking to patients and stakeholders, right? They have things to teach me. And that's kind of a message I try and share with my trainees as well. Everybody has something to teach you. Any conversation, you can walk away learning something.
That's true. That's
So-
really great advice. So you alluded to this earlier, and I can't let you go without telling us a little bit about your job as equity advisor for School of Biological Sciences. This is the role in which you're helping ensure that we're doing diverse searches for new faculty and solving difficult problems. What has been the most surprising aspect of that job? What has really surprised you?
So, as I'm a woman who's been a scientist for a long time, pushing 30 years now. And for probably 20 years of that time, I didn't think that there was bias against women. I've always been pretty successful. I've done well in school. I didn't think there were problems. But you get to a certain point and you start to feel the resistance, right? And you start to wonder, is this due to gender? And so being equity advisor, which I've been for like 5 years now, one of the things that I feel is a responsibility is to read up, right, on bias against people of color, bias against women. And now that I have read these things, I can recognize the patterns. And I see it so much more clearly at this stage. So I think one thing that being equity advisor has taught me is that gender bias and bias against people of color or people from underrepresented groups is real, right?
Yes.
And even if we don't mean to be biased, we are. It's subconscious.
It's part of human biology in
Yes.
some way.
Yes.
Just
And-
really disturbing, actually.
Yes. And so one of my jobs, as you mentioned, is to go talk to search committees who are going to look for new faculty members to try and talk to them about how to be inclusive and overcome their biases. And I always say, I went to the Project Implicit website. So there's a Harvard website where you can go and take a test
Oh, I've
to
done
figure
that.
out what
It's
your
very
biases are.
revealing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I've taken the one on women in science several times. So it's to elicit whether you're biased against women who are scientists. And every single time I've taken it, which is 3, I've come out moderately biased against women scientists. And so I always point that out, right? Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I'm not biased. I grew up in the same society you did. Just because I'm biased, it doesn't mean I'm a bad person, right? It means I have something to work on.
Right.
That's all. So,
Right.
people say things and do things, and I make mistakes all the time in sort of the DEI universe. I say the wrong thing. And that's another place where we have to be kind to ourselves and not beat ourselves up when we make mistakes, but just learn from them and move forward.
Right. And try to implement better systems to acknowledge in advance it's going to happen. We've got to catch it early.
Yes.
So what motivates you every day?
Well, I think the fundamental thing is I want to leave the world a better place than I found it.
I love it.
Right?
That's
Everybody kind of says that. And the secondary part of that is I realized sort of when you asked me about when did you decide to found a company, one of the things I realized was if I don't do this, nobody else will. It just won't happen. And so that's another thing that motivates me to go forward. If I walk away, it's probably going to be the end. I don't think anybody else is going to take exactly the approach we're taking.
Right. And have that deep background and deep
Yes.
appreciation of animals and metabolism and
Yes.
horseback riding and all those things that you bring
Yes.
to your questions.
Yes.
I can definitely see that. So where can listeners learn more about you and your program, your projects, and your companies?
Well, I think probably the best place is we do have a website. It's edingerlab.bio.uci.edu. And actually on that website, there's one of the options on the menu bar is not a scientist. And I've gotten a lot of really positive feedback. So that's a part of the site that's written in lay language for people who aren't scientists and sort of
Oh.
explains what we do
What a
in very
good idea.
general terms. Yeah.
That's very rare, actually. I don't know many scientists
Yeah.
who have something for the lay public on there. That's
Yeah.
great. What motivated you to put that on there? That's an unusual feature.
Yeah, I think it's the interactions I've had with patients and stakeholders. And
Okay.
some of the funding that I've gotten has been from foundations that actually involve patients and stakeholders. When I reviewed for the American Cancer Society, there were always 2 patient advocates on the review committee who reviewed grants just like the scientists.
Wow.
And so, like I said, I've developed a great amount of respect for lots of diverse opinions. And so I wanted to be our work to be accessible to everybody.
And it also must give you a perspective about these important problems, something you alluded to earlier.
Yes.
So if if you're talking to physicians, talking to patients, you hear about challenges, right?
Yes. And I often tell my students, if you can't explain to your mother or your grandmother why this matters, then you're doing the wrong thing.
That's true. So if you met anybody whose cancer is exactly what Seige Pharmaceuticals is aiming for?
Yeah, actually, there's one patient who's emailed me a few times asking when our drug is going to be available,
Wow.
saying he's read our papers and he's
Really?
really excited about it. Yeah.
Wow.
And
So what do you tell them?
I tell him, we're almost there. We're trying,
Work faster?
IND hopefully on the horizon. So,
Really? Oh,
yes,
that's exciting.
hang in there.
That's really great. And Seige Pharmaceuticals is located here in
Yes.
Beal Applied Innovation, right?
Yes.
You have
yes.
lab space in University Lab Partners. Tell us a little
Correct.
bit about that. We have just a couple minutes left, but I think this is such a unique and powerful resource we have on campus.
Oh, yeah. So that was one of the most difficult things about starting a company is there was no wet lab space that you could use. So if a building was paid for with government funds, you weren't
Right.
allowed to do activities there that were considered commercial. So there was no space on campus. We had to wait until this space was available nearby. I mean, before we were looking at incubators in San Diego or Los
Wow.
Angeles, which would have been really difficult.
Right.
So we have a $2 million grant from the
Oh,
National
cool.
Cancer Institute, right?
Oh, congrats.
And getting those grants depends on you having lab space.
Right.
And so having this space so close to UCI was instrumental.
That's great. So then it allows you to have lots of interactions, train people, great flow of information backwards and forwards.
Yes.
That sounds really great.
Yes. And leverage our networks, right? So my network after 16 years at UCI is also available to the principal scientist and CEO of Seige.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And it also keeps the CEO of Seige near us as well. So
Yes.
we can leverage his network as well.
Absolutely.
Because I know it's Dan Gill, right?
Yes.
Former
yes.
Allergan.
We're super lucky, yes,
Yeah.
to get Dan on board.
Giant in the pharmaceutical industry. It's
Yes.
great choice. Well, there's so much to learn from today, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Amy. Thank you so much for joining us. I also want to thank the listeners for listening to Rising Tide Changemakers. If you like our show, please leave us a review and share with your friends. And I'll close by reminding you that in this world, nothing is permanent except change.
Well, there you have it, another episode of Rising Tide Changemakers. It's a production of UCI Beal Applied Innovation and is recorded at the OC Talk Radio Studio right here at the Cove at UCI. And of course, we want to give a shout out to our team. The podcast is made possible by associate producer Ethan Perez and yours truly, sound engineer Paul Roberts. For more information about UCI Beal Applied Innovation, you can visit us online at innovation.edu. At innovation.uci.edu. Innovation.uci.edu. Any opinions or endorsements expressed in this podcast are those of the host and the guest only and do not represent the views of UCI Beal Applied Innovation, the University of California, Irvine, Regents of the University of California, Irvine, or any other organization associated with this show.